One of the most viewed videos on our YouTube channel is this one about why the Nintendo PlayStation was never released. This is part of the Dark History series of videos. What this video kind of goes over is the creation of the PlayStation, and specifically Nintendo's role in kind of forcing Sony to become their rivals, and how that was possibly a massive mistake. Well, there's some more information that's come out since the release of this video. Now you'll see this video came out around September of 2016, and there is a wonderful article. Now this is all in Japanese, but there is a translation. You guys should read the entire thing. It is at nintendoeverything.com. So Nintendo Everything was able to put the whole thing, the whole transcript into English. And this is extremely interesting because it casts the entire storyline in a completely different light. Now, had this information been available when I made my video, I would have jumped on it. And as you can see, this is November of 2016. This was just a little bit after my video came out. It's only been recently pointed out to me that this article even exists, though. And what this goes over is a lot of the drama that we understand to be completely Nintendo's fault was really, at its core, not a big deal at all to almost anyone at Sony. They didn't really care about this entire situation. It was Ken Kutaragi who pushed everybody with his own ambitions at heart to take on Nintendo. Now, it's something I think the company is grateful for, and they're happy that they did. But at the time, it was just, this whole thing's a lot weirder than I think people realize. So right here we have an interview with some behind the scenes info about what was actually happening with the SNES PlayStation. Dwango head Nobuo Kawakami interviewed Shigeo Maruyama, who was once the CEO of Sony Music Entertainment, as well as the former chairman of Sony Computer Entertainment, right? So this guy knows what he's talking about. Maruyama talked about the situation with the SNES PlayStation and also offered insight into the mind of Ken Kutaragi, who, if you've seen my video here, you'll know Ken Kutaragi played a huge part at Sony surrounding the development of the PlayStation. So the first quote that I have here from the interview is that the president of Nintendo of America, Mr. Arakawa, he saw Ken Kutaragi's whole CD-ROM add-on to the Super NES as a big problem. So he messaged Japan's HQ, and he said, if you let Kutaragi do whatever he wants, he might take over the entire company. Now, Mr. Arakawa is what you would call really smart. Somebody who saw what was happening. He saw the direction the industry was heading, and he knew that, a competitor, specifically within the CD-ROM industry, was likely going to kind of mess with what Nintendo was doing at the time. So he was saying, hey, don't let Sony jump into this market. It's literally going to mess us up, right? Maruyama here says, we explicitly told them we were going to focus on anything but video games. And they said, that's fine, meaning Nintendo. So the agreement between Sony and Nintendo was that Sony was going to use this add-on to create other things. Like Maruyama talks in this article about wanting to create like a karaoke video game where you plug it in, and at the time they didn't really have the karaoke console kind of things that you have now. That at least they have in Japan now. Karaoke's huge in Japan. But he was thinking, hey, you already got your SNES there, it's plugged in, just put this add-on on top of it and you can play your music and you can have karaoke, right? And that's wonderful. But of course, Ken Kutaragi had different ambitions. So let's move on here a little bit to this next page. Yamauchi may have decided that the CD-ROMs have potential. Now, when you talk about Yamauchi, they're talking about the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Now, this guy, seeing that the ROMs have potential, as well as the CEO of Nintendo of America, who they were both looking at this whole situation, and they felt uneasy about Ken Kutaragi's pushy behavior. So Kutaragi was a little bit forceful with this whole thing, and it kind of put Nintendo off a little bit. So, as we go over to the next quote I have here, it's a real mystery why Sony never actually filed any kind of lawsuit against them. I get the feeling something was going on behind the scenes. After all, there had to be a reason why Sony wasn't able to go after them. Okay, that's a little interesting, right? Let's move on to the next part, and this is where we really get into the meat of this whole drama. So you'd tell your coworkers this is all Nintendo's fault, loud enough for everyone to hear. Now this is where the story really starts. Kutaragi set all this into motion for some reason. The head of Nintendo, Mr. Yamauchi, and the head of Sony, Mr. Oga, both approved the project originally, but it fell apart right at the end. This is common. This isn't an uncommon thing to happen for two businesses. Kutaragi had begun stirring up trouble within the company and even came up to Mr. Oga and said Sony's very own Norio Oga gave his approval, but the project got canned for no reason. If you back out now, how will you maintain your honor? Now, for anybody that knows anything about business in Japan and the way it's conducted, the whole honor-shame dynamic is so potent in Japan. And people literally make massive decisions around specifically just whether or not something would bring them honor or brought them shame. If a company disrespects you and you just take it, it's a problem. So, of course, Mr. Oga responds, "You are right. This has brought us shame." So the way that this is all framed by Maruyama is that Ken Kutaragi kind of had his own ambitions here, and he got, one of the higher-ups at Sony really riled up about the whole thing and thinking that this was a complete shame. Now, as to what Nintendo did, absolutely makes sense, right? And Kawakami even brings that up later here in this article. He says, it's only natural the company would be angry, but Maruyama says, well, you're sort of right, but let me get back to an earlier topic. So let's move on a little bit. Right here, Kawakami, who's the one interviewing him, says, so you're saying we don't exactly know what happened, but we do know that Kutaragi took advantage of the situation. That's right. So, let's move on to this next quote here. All we were doing was making an external CD-ROM drive. It was just a drop in the bucket. Even taking into account their software businesses, Sony didn't consider it a big deal, Kawakami asks. Maruyama answers, it was a lot of money for us at the music entertainment, but to the whole of Sony it was pocket change. Kutaragi belligerently argued over the royalties made from the sound chips, which he created for Nintendo, and said, I made this money, so let me use it at my own discretion. So I'm assuming the budget was only around 2 or 3 billion yen or so, right? Nothing crazy. Then Kawakami is saying, that's not a ton of money considering the scope of an enterprise as big as Sony. So Maruyama says, yeah, and the CD-ROM drive was just this little thing stuck on top of the SNES. It's like we were just renting an office instead of building ourselves an entire skyscraper. And then at the last minute, they simply kicked us out. Sure, it sucked, but that should have been the end of it. Instead, Kutaragi managed to turn the story around, saying, how dare they, now we have to build an even bigger skyscraper right next to them. But really, the two things had nothing to do with each other. So the interviewer here says, that sounds like a lot of nonsense. Ken Kutaragi made the whole thing out to be bigger than it really was, trying to use the situation to further his own ambitions. And Maruyama agrees, saying, yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Now, he doesn't know what went on with Nintendo, obviously, and no one knows exactly why, but odds are Nintendo could kind of sense, and specifically with the way that we read earlier here, that Kutaragi was a little bit pushy, and that's why Yamauchi ultimately decided, we're not doing business with you. I think there was some feeling that even though Sony had said, hey, we're not doing video games, that Yamauchi had said, you know what? Maybe they are gonna do video games. And honestly, after hearing Ken Kutaragi's story, and you can get more of that in my video here, Ken Kutaragi wanted to make video games. He really wanted, he watched his daughter playing the NES, and he thought it was just the coolest thing ever. He wanted into this industry, and I think it made Nintendo very uncomfortable. And so the whole thing that happened with Nintendo backing out and deciding, hey, let's not really do this, and Kutaragi convincing Sony to let them build the PlayStation, which is crazy, huge expenditure, big off branch of the company, ended up being very successful for them, but risky at the same time, and it all stemmed from him convincing the CEO of Sony that he was so shameful that now we have to outdo them and we got to spend all this money to put them back in their place. And sure, it worked, but I think Nintendo had some sense that Sony, or at least Ken Kutaragi, with the influence he had, he was kind of going this direction anyways. He was going to make it so that Sony was entering the video game market one way or the other. And Nintendo could either be in partnership with them at first, or could go their own way and let Sony do what they will. And ultimately decided on the latter option. Now, some people lament the decision because of things like Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, or even Final Fantasy VII, or whatever may have been. given a potential combination of the two systems. But honestly, who knows what really would have happened? And it's very likely that Sony was going to get into this game of making video games either way. And Nintendo did not want Sony to infringe on their game-making space. So no matter what, the results would likely have been pretty similar, I think, to what ended up happening. We don't need to hold any fantasies about what might have been before if Nintendo and Sony were allies forever, because it was a small project to begin with, and Nintendo could sense that something was off with Ken Kutaragi kind of off the bat. And so this whole project was just, it turned into something else. But honestly, it wasn't that big of a deal to begin with. It was a small thing that Nintendo said, nah, we're going to go with this other company now instead of you. And it turned into this big thing at Sony, partly because of Ken Kutaragi. So honestly, in a lot of ways, we should be thankful to him because he furthered the video game industry in a way that Nintendo was going to play a little more conservatively with cartridges going into the late 90s. But, at the same time, they both kind of played each other a little bit, and Nintendo may have got the short end of the stick in the end, but this whole game is just kind of business as usual in Japan. And this is the stuff that happens, and the whole PlayStation's existence was just getting back at Nintendo. I just can't believe it. It's like a grudge. Anyways, this was an update to my Dark History video. Thanks for watching, everybody. You guys are beasts, and we'll see you later.